Hello everyone and welcome back to my Warhammer 40k guides. I am Brady and today I would like to talk about -1 to hit armies. I've noticed on forums a lot of people talking about the rumor of -1 to hit armies being changed to always in cover instead of -1 to hit. And personally, I don't think the change is needed. To be transparent, yes, a couple of my main armies has a lot of -1 to hit, but this is not why I think the change isn't needed. Like I've said in the past, when I think something is too strong, I will say it, even if it affects my own armies. The best example of this was back when I was spamming Malefic Lords back in the early days of 8th edition, and I was one of the people hoping for them to get changed because they were way too powerful at the time. And I'm the type of player that if my competitive tournament list gets nerfed too much, I just build a new army. I don't complain about the changes, I live with them, and I move on. With that said, I personally don't feel like -1 to hit is an issue, and I aim to prove that in this video. Before we get into the main topic though, this video was sponsored by themagnetbaron.com. They offer magnets of all shapes and sizes, magnetized movement trays, magnetized flight stands, and they even offer fully built magnetized models, all for a great price. And until October 31st, they are having a 2-for-1 deal, so if you're thinking about picking up any magnets for the hobby, then check out themagnetbaron.com. A link will be in the description. So I've noticed a good amount of community having a vocal opinion on -1 to hit, and a good amount of people claiming that they think it will be changed in chapter approved coming out in a month or so. I have some opinions on this that I would like to share. First off, let me start with the big thing that leads me to believe the negative modifiers aren't going anywhere, and that is the Daka rule from the new Orcs Codex. It states that Orcs always hit on a 6 despite modifiers. Why would Games Workshop release this rule in a brand new codex if they intended on changing the -1 to hit modifiers to be something else? If there were no negative modifiers, then Orcs wouldn't need this rule since they would hit at their normal ballistic skill of 5+, or if they moved with a heavy weapon, it would still be on 6+. So this is the first thing that leads me to this conclusion. This also leads me to believe that negative hit modifiers will stack, because if it was only a -1 you could give to a unit, then Orcs would still hit on 6s anyways. You could argue Daka is for when they move and shoot with heavy weapons, but realistically, you could just stand still and shoot with your heavy weapons to hit on 6 as well, so Daka wouldn't be needed from a balance sense. So again, this one rule makes me believe that nothing is going to change for negative to hit modifiers. Another thing that leads me to believe that Games Workshop isn't changing negative modifiers is that they have clear counters. And if something has very clear counters in the game, then it usually isn't changed. For example, flamers or auto-hit weapons are great against negative modifiers. Stuff like the new Knight or even Hellhounds are pretty decent at doing damage to -1 to hit units. And a lot of armies have access to units with flamers or auto-hitting units, especially when you consider allies, because again, you can't forget about allies for how the game is balanced around using allies to cover areas that your army can't cover. And yes, Necrons don't have allies, or Orcs don't have allies, or Tau don't have allies, but they also have other rules and units that help them that are built into their main faction. Necrons can get a +1 to hit with My Will Be Done to negate a negative hit modifier, and Orcs can just charge the stuff because most negative modifiers don't affect close combat, and that's something I'll talk about in a minute. And Tau can bring Avaras that are really good with auto-hit weapons. So yes, every army in the game can either bring an auto-hit weapon themselves or ally something in that can do it. Or they have other ways of dealing with the negative modifiers. The next counter to -1 to hit is melee, just like I mentioned with the Orcs. I've played my Alpha Legion army against melee armies and wondered to myself, why am I playing Alpha Legion again? Because the Legion trait was next to useless against all of their melee stuff. Also, I personally believe mixed lists are the way to go for competitive. And when I say a mixed list, I mean shooting and melee in one list. I think going straight shooting leaves you with some strategic holes, and I think going straight melee leaves you with some strategic holes as well, depending on the build. So I think it's best to incorporate both types of combat into your list if you want to compete at a high level. Just look at most of the lists in my top 10 videos. Pretty close to all of these lists feature both elements of shooting and melee, and I'm assuming it's because of this reason. Now there's a third counter for -1 to hit as well, and that is psychic abilities. Smite doesn't need to roll to hit. Spells don't need to roll to hit. They just auto-hit if you get the spell off. So if you incorporate some psychic into your list as well, which I think you always should if you have it in your army, then you have yet another counter for negative to hit modifiers. There are even spells that give stuff like +1 to hit like Prescience, so that works as well. These three things counter negative to hit modifiers and do it very well. So again, in my opinion, I don't think negative to hit is too strong by any means. It does what it's supposed to, which is being a counter to pure gun lines, which I think we can all admit would be too strong if the -1 to hit didn't exist. With all of this said, what would happen if -1 to hit modifiers were removed from the game? Well, gun lines would by far be the most dominant armies in the game, in my opinion. And with all the complaints from the FAQ from people claiming melee is in a bad enough spot already, which personally I don't think it is, but that's a topic for another video, why remove a rule that encourages armies to include a few melee units, and why remove a rule that keeps pure gun lines in check? Melee is a great counter to -1 to hit, so people are forced to bring some melee units in their lists to deal with it. Without -1 to hit, you can just play your traditional gun line with little to no counters, which I think would be very unhealthy for the game, especially when it comes to diversity. And if negative modifiers were replaced with always in cover, I personally don't feel like that changes anything or is good enough to counter gun lines. In a world full of tons of AP weaponry and volume of shots, that +1 save isn't doing much. Yes, it does still help a little bit by making your army a little bit more durable, but personally, I don't think that's enough for me to want to incorporate auto hit units or melee units into my list, because I feel like my gun lines would still be able to do fine with mass amount of shots over that. Which leads me to another thing about -1 to hit armies and gun lines. If you bring enough guns and enough shots, you can just power through the negative to hit modifiers and still get some damage out. My current Drukhari army is pretty much a pure gun line and doesn't have very much melee or auto hit or anything like that. And I've played against negative modifier armies and have still done well, because my army brings enough shots that I can power through that -1 to hit. Sure, it does suck and I don't get as many hits as I normally would against an army that doesn't have negative to hit modifiers, but if you shoot enough shots and you pick your targets properly, you can still do damage. And speaking about picking targets properly, I've noticed in my own game, so again this is anecdotal so take it as you will, but I've noticed in my own games that when I'm playing against some players, they don't have the best target priority when it comes to targeting my units because of the negative modifiers. I've been in games where someone has targeted one of my flyers because it was missing a couple of wounds and decided they wanted to kill it. But then I would use a stratagem, lightning fast reactions, to give it an extra -1, making that flyer -2 to hit altogether. And instead of changing their targets to something else with the rest of their army, they will continue shooting their entire army at that one unit, which means their gun line won't be working as efficient as it is. Why not stop targeting that unit and target the other flyer instead that's only -1? That'll give you a better chance of killing it. Sure, the one that you want to target is already missing a couple wounds, but with that -2, you're not going to get nearly as much hits in there as you would against the other flyer that's only -1. So I think some of this debate boils down to people just not reliably knowing how to deal with -1 to hit armies, which is what I am aiming to accomplish with this video, is trying to show you guys that you can deal with -1 to hit armies, and they're not as overpowered as some of you may think. Also, I've heard people saying that they don't think that -1 to hit is going away entirely, but they think that stacking -1 to hit is going to go away. Personally, I don't think that's going to happen either, because it changes something that I don't think a lot of people realize. When you move with a heavy weapon, you suffer a negative to hit modifier of -1 that you give yourself from moving and shooting a heavy weapon. Now let's say if you want to shoot at an army that has a natural -1, or they use a stratagem to give it a -1, or a spell to give it a -1, well, you're only going to get one of those -1s, so essentially that unit gets to move and shoot their heavy weapons at no penalty by themselves. You essentially gave that unit power of the machine spirit or an equivalent rule so that they don't actually suffer an extra -1 for moving and shooting. So that'll make heavy weapons so much more stronger, so you can just move around and still shoot at -1 armies at only -1 without having to suffer your own penalty that the weapon would give you. I think this is something that a lot of people overlook and don't really realize would have a huge effect on the way the game is played and how army lists are built. So when it comes to army-wide -1s, when it comes to stratagems that give -1s, when it comes to spells that give -1s, when it comes to stacking all this stuff, I personally think it's all fine. Again, if it was removed, I feel like gun lines like Astra Militarum and Tau especially would start dominating the meta even more than they already are. Well, Tau's not necessarily dominating, but I still think it's a very, very strong army. Same thing with Astra Militarum, except they actually are dominating. They're one of the best armies, and they have been for a very long time now. Overall, I think negative modifiers are balanced and they're fine. If you play a pure gun line, then you might disagree with me. But if you do disagree with me because you play a pure gun line, that's like playing scissors in a game of rock, paper, scissors and complaining that rock is too overpowered. -1 to hit armies are supposed to counter pure gun lines. They're the one thing in the game that are keeping pure gun lines in check. Without -1 to hit armies, competitive players can skip out on taking auto hit units, they can skip out on taking melee units, and they can just go pure gun line, which is something I don't think the majority of the community wants. And it's not like the counters are that rare either. Almost every army can include some sort of auto-hitting units. They can include melee units, and they can also include psychic spells. So again, it's very easy to counter if you're willing to adjust to it instead of just playing a pure gun line and begging Games Workshop to balance the game the way you want it so that you don't have to change your list or adapt. And for those of you who are now saying, well Brady, aren't you being a little hypocritical? You already admitted that you play a pure gun line and your gun line incorporates -1 to hit. So aren't you begging Games Workshop to not change it so you don't have to change your playstyle or adapt? And to that I would say no, because I'm the type of player that is willing to change my list and I've done it tons of times. My current Dark Eldar list has gone through about 5 or 6 variations until I finally came up with one that I liked that fits the current meta. So if they did remove -1 to hit from like all of my Venoms and all of my Flyers and all of that stuff, then I would just change my list around and find a new way to play in the new meta. I would either do that or I would just pick a different army since I do have multiple armies to pick from. I'm not loyal to any one army, especially when it comes to competitive. I will always play what I think will give me the best chance of winning. So depending on whatever the meta is at the time, I will always adjust my list and try to work to fit into that meta. So if Games Workshop does remove the -1, which I highly doubt they will, but let's just say they do, again, I will adjust to it. It's not a big problem to me. That's going to be it for this video. It's short and sweet, but it covers all the points that I wanted to cover. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think, as I still read all of my comments even if I don't reply to them all. Also, don't forget to check out some of my other competitive 40k content if you want to up your competitive game, or if you even just want to play your casual games a bit more strategically. Also, if you're looking for some basic coaching or a community of 40k players to discuss the game with, then check me out on Patreon. A $5 pledge gets you access to the Almost Pro Gaming Discord channel alongside basic coaching and list building from yours truly. So if you wanted to up your game even further or just talk to people about 40k, then consider subscribing to my Patreon. Also, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next video. Happy wargaming!